It's confirmed new classic cards, replacements for the Hall of Fame are coming, and I have some ideas for what they're going to look like.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, if you didn't hear, it's been theorized for a while. It's something Blizzard told me at the summit and finally confirmed via Mike Dene on a stream recently that the classic replacements for Hall of Fame cards are coming very, very soon, like in the next week or so, apparently. And a while ago, we had some leaked names that were also confirmed on Reddit that those were future cards of some sort. So things like Brightwing and Whitemane. And I took those leaked names and I theorized here some cards that might match up to my expectations for what Blizzard's going to do. Now, fair warning, these are just totally out of thin air for me, custom cards, but based on the characters, based on some of the things they're replacing, based on trends we've seen in the past for classic cards replacements, in other words, they're kind of weak on average, I think these could be what the cards end up looking like. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Up first here, I have Brightwing, which is an awesome character for me to see in Hearthstone because it was one of my favorite characters to play in Here's the Storm. The first time I hit rank 1, which was like Legend way back in the day in Here's the Storm, I played a lot of Brightwing to get there. She is a fairy dragon, which in Hearthstone for some reason means she's probably also a dragon, even though that's not really a good lore fit. And in this case, I made Brightwing a 6-mana 4/6, and I essentially stole Baron Geddon's effect for Brightwing, but I turned it into healing instead of damage. So she's kind of like a friendly Baron Geddon in a way. At the end of your turn, restore 2 health to all friendly characters. Now, I didn't make it all characters like Baron Geddon, obviously, but this is what you see with Brightwing in Heroes of the Storm. I basically stole her passive in Heroes of the Storm and put it in a card, which is the sort of thing Blizzard might do. Also, I think this is just a safe feeling kind of card. It's a bit like a scaled up dark scale healer, but with some upside if it lives longer. And as a neutral card, you can put it in lots of different classes, but certainly something like Priest would make a lot of sense for this, or maybe like a heal Druid archetype. This could go a really long way as well for healing multiple characters simultaneously. So is this a home run, like all-star awesome card? No, I don't think this would be played all that much, only very occasionally, but that's exactly what I expect from these classic replacement cards. I don't think they're going to be, defining awesome everyday legendaries. They're going to be more of that niche style where only some decks are very, very occasionally playing them. Because the whole point is we Hall of Fame these cards that were too good, like Sylvanas and Ragnaros. We're not going to come back in with new legendaries that are also still too good. So I think this finds a nice balance between a little bit of playability, but not going overboard, and it's certainly a good fit for the character, so I'd love to see a Brightwing that looks exactly like this. Up next here, I have High Inquisitor Whitemane, a popular character from like Scarlet Monastery in World of Warcraft, and she's an Inquisitor, which I guess her deal is all about dealing damage and healing that damage back. So I wanted to capture that in her effect here. That's why she has a battle cry that deals 5 damage and lifesteal, so you regain that 5 damage. So a bit like a Holy Fire with a 5/5 attached. You could even think of it like maybe like a Firelands portal in a way, with some life gain on top of it for a little bit of extra mana. So there are some comparisons here where she's, relatively favorable to, although 8 mana makes her considerably slower, particularly than something like Holy Fire. So a bit awkward to use, perhaps, waiting on her forever until the late game. But if you get there, a little bit of a swing card. You could almost even compare this like Ultimate Infestation without the card draw, right? And I think this is one of the better competitive cards I put in this list. I think there are some decks that might be able to play this, but it doesn't have that same just like pervasive threat of something like Ragnaros, which I envisioned this card replacing. It still has some immediate board impact. It's actually kind of a split between Ragnaros and Ragnaros Lightlord, but it's not as immense a threat. Like, it doesn't absolutely scare you. It just gives you some of that swing potential, some of that defensive utility. So would many decks be running this? I don't think this would get included in a lot of lists, but coming off of random effects sometimes, absolutely a card like this would be fantastic. And there might still be a list here and there that could really utilize this lifesteal. If she does stick on board, she could heal for 10, 15, right? The increments continue to go up because she herself has lifesteal on attacks as well. So the potential to stabilize off a card like this is relatively high, but also just very easily removed. Throw a fireball at it and it's gone. So I think a good fit for the character in a lot of ways, and would be a fairly safe inclusion as a replacement for a scary card like Ragnaros. So I think we'll see something trending towards this for the Hearthstone design team. So now let's move on to some of the class cards here, starting off with Radiance, and this is something I'm putting into Paladin to replace essentially Divine Favor. Now, I'm not doing like a one-to-one where there's some card draw element, because I don't think that's what happens when we see these Hall of Fame replacements. Sometimes they're just, you know, random generic things that kind of fit the class. And I thought this one would be a nice one to throw Paladin a bone, because also Equality got nerfed, and this kind of borrows from Equality's effects. So you might say, oh, Regis, we've seen this in Paladin before. This isn't creative or cool. You're right, and I'm not trying to be creative or cool. I'm trying to give what a realistic representation of these designs might look like. So this would be a new Paladin secret, and it reads, when an enemy minion attacks your hero, change its attack and health to 1. So it's this one-off equality style effect where if you can line it up and your opponent has an 8/8 on board and they want to attack you, you're essentially negating it down to a 1/1. So it's worse than something like Vaporize in a lot of ways, which might just kill the minion, but it should be, because it's a 1-mana Paladin secret instead of a 3-mana Mage secret. So fitting for the class. I think a relatively, impactful card in some ways, but also a big chance to backfire. If a 1/1 attacks, it basically does absolutely nothing. So a little bit of a risk reward there. Awkward to use in some cases, probably fine off of like Desperate Measures, random secret generation, but maybe not something that ever gets run in a deck. Maybe not even a secret Paladin deck would really find a home for this, which, as we've seen, these replacement cards tend to be on the weaker side of things. They're not typically played. They're not at that competitively viable level. So I think this one hits all the marks for looking like a realistic option for one of these cards. So now let's take a look at Gift of the Wild. This was another name that's pretty clearly going to be lined up for Druid, and in this case I'm making it a 1-mana spell that reads, give a minion Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 Treant. So this is basically Soul of the Forest, but a one-off, a limited use Soul of the Forest. And I don't think this card is very good. There's obviously a lot of better options out there that do similar things, probably both in Druid and outside of Druid. Think about like Ancestral Spirit for Shaman, right? Like, it's way better than Gift of the Wild. But nonetheless, again, I think these cards are supposed to be a little weak. They're not going to be the replacement for Naturalize that it should be. You're not going to get something awesome and powerful. You're going to get something that just feels like it fits the class. It's a buff card, which we know Druids have. I think it fits the name really nicely. Like, you're getting some kind of gift. It's Treant themed, which we've seen a lot of Treant themed cards. It matches up with something we've seen in the classic set, which is Soul of the Forest. So it just feels like a realistic option. I know the artwork I chose here has 3 dudes. Just deal with it. This is only 1 dude. I get it. But it looks like, maybe they got some tree stuff happening. So across the board, who knows if this is remotely close to what we'll see, but it feels like the kind of thing that could be the option they choose. So now let's move on to Warlock with a Waxmancer Adept. This would be a card that replaces Doomguard, essentially, and I think Blizzard wants to move a little bit away from Discard and certainly Charge, so I didn't want to capture either of those mechanics in this card. Instead, what I wanted to do is go for more of a kind of zoo or minion summoning theme. This is a lot of stuff we've seen in Warlock. So this is a 5-mana 3/3 Battlecry summon a 3/3 Wax construct with Taunt that dies at the start of your turn. So we've also had a lot of minion death theme in Warlock. And the idea here is, right, you get 6/6 in stats for 5 mana, which is okay. You get a Taunt, which is in a pinch, a nice defensive thing. But he is not an expert at being a Waxmancer. And as we know, Wax tends to melt. So this 3/3 Taunt that he's summoning will melt at the end of the turn. So it's this in a pinch defensive card if you absolutely need to stick a couple minions and you need a Taunt. Just to protect yourself against an oncoming onslaught, then this is a possibility. Again, I think this is a pretty weak card. I don't think this would be played much. I don't think it fits into a zoo deck. I think it's way more just like an arena card that's okay, not something in Constructed that looks remotely viable, and that's by design. I just want to be careful to remind you guys that. I think this is weak, but it fits the name really nicely, and this is going to be a name of a card, so in some way, trying to capture that name is difficult, but I think this effect and mechanic does line up in a pretty fun and creative way for this name. So next up here we have the SI7 Infiltrator, and I wanted to put an SI7 card in Rogue, but I don't know what we're replacing in Rogue. Conceal already got replaced for a Hall of Fame, so I think this must be a neutral card replacement. So I just made it a nice little simple 2-mana 2/2 here with an effect that a lot of people have put onto cards in the past, which is that it ignores Taunt. I figured if it's infiltrating behind enemy lines, then perhaps Taunts don't matter. It's just going around the back anyway, and attacking face. So a really simple, potentially aggro style card here. A little bit of upside on a 2-mana 2/2. Not nearly as good as something like Knife Juggler probably, but again, that's by design. I don't think it's impossible that a Zoo-style deck would play this if there weren't any other 2-drop options that made sense for them. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's likely to see play, but, you know, it captures the name nicely, so perhaps it might look like this. Siegebreaker is another name we got here, and I know this art features a pretty prominent lore character, but don't worry about it. Hearthstone has a tendency to reuse artwork just to fit whatever they need, ignoring any sort of lore implications. I made this a 7-mana 3/3 minion, and I figured if he's breaking a siege, that means a lot of people are attacking, and somehow he's dealing with that. So Battlecry here reads, if your opponent has 7 minions, destroy all enemy minions. So it's a great board clear, total swing style card, but only if your opponent has a full board. So it has some play around potential, and very rarely would actually line up, right? Only in some cases or some decks would this be a safe inclusion. Things like maybe token Druid decks where they go with wisps. You could certainly remove all the wisps, etc. So it has some potential as that swing card, like maybe in Arena, it's that like last ditch effort thing that like you punish your opponent for not thinking about it. And I think those cards are fun. But at the end of the day, because it's so situational and because it has so much play around, you only play 6 minions most of the time. If you need to avoid this, if it ever became meta relevant, it'd be bad instantly. For all those reasons, I don't really ever think this would see play either. And again, that's by design. I don't know if I'm reiterating this enough. But still, I think it'd be a fun card that certainly captures the name, and it would be a nice little inclusion in the classic set. And then finally here I have the Plaguebringer, a 5-mana 6/4 with Death Rattle, deal 4 damage to each hero. And this one, you know, I just kind of took a shot in the dark on the name. It's hard to imagine what a Plaguebringer might do. We see things like Leper Gnome, you know, where it's Death Rattle, deal damage to hero. So I figured, hey, why not try Plaguebringer with some damage to hero? But let's make it symmetrical just for the heck of it. So it reminds me a bit of something like Abomination, where it's dealing damage to multiple symmetrical things, but not the board. Instead, it's focused on the hero. So just kind of a card that's aligned more aggressively and more for an aggro deck. I don't really think aggro decks would play this just because it's at 4 health. It seems susceptible, but you don't mind it dying necessarily. But nowadays, healing in aggro decks is almost prioritized a little bit with Ziliax. You can see like Life Drinker and like Tempo Rogues and stuff. So you sacrificing 4 health can be risky when you're often racing your opponents in an aggro versus an aggro environment. So I don't think Plaguebringer would be the sort of card that really makes the cut. Maybe some Death Rattle aggro decks out there still love a card like this if they have some healing or backup plans, or they're just so fast. It's a possibility, but because of the delay on the effect, because of the susceptible body, it would fit the name. It'd be a cool classic card. The artwork feels very neutral and classic, but nonetheless, probably not the most competitive option. And then finally here I have the Barrens Stable Hand, a 6-mana 2/4, and the Battlecry reads, draw a card. If it's a minion, summon it. So I like the idea here of the Stable Hand in the Barrens. Like a lot of people come through the Barrens. It gives you a mount, perhaps, right? Because it's a stable hand. It gives you a horse to ride. So it's giving you something, and you're going into action immediately, right? So it's kind of the Battlecry is trying to capture that idea. As a 6-mana 2/4, though, very, very weak body attached to a 6-mana card. But, you know, if you can summon a big, scary 8/8 or something, if you can summon a Mountain Giant, you're pretty excited. A 6-mana Mountain Giant plus a 2/4 to boot's fine, and you draw a card, and that's nice. So some upside, but also some real downside, a hard card to build around because you might just draw a 1/1, and then you're summoning a 1/1 that has a really valuable Battlecry that you're losing. So I don't think this would ever become a staple card, but it is a cool idea for something like a big deck in some ways, but then you're polluting your Resurrect Pool and Priest with the 2/4. So there's always this kind of upside and downside with this sort of card. Maybe it's a little too much potential for a Hall of Fame replacement card, but I don't really think so. It's still, if you draw a spell, it completely whiffs, and that's a hard thing to do. That's a risk. Most decks have to run spells, at least a couple. Even in like a Conjurer's Mage deck where it's mostly minions, there are still small things that backfire. So a real deck building challenge, but one that would be fun for the classic set. And although I don't know this artwork choice was by any means the best, I still did my very best to capture what a Barrens stable hand might look like. And there you go. That wraps it up for this video. Those are my ideas for classic replacement cards based on the names. I use the names as inspiration to design these sorts of things. If I get any of these right, it'll be an absolute miracle. I'd like to hear your thoughts based on these names, which we know are at least somewhat relevant and real. What do you think these cards could look like? What would a Brightwing be? What would a Whitemane be? What would a Barrens stable hand look like? I want to hear your thoughts on all of these cards because I have a feeling they're going to be announced very, very soon, which, by the way, is pretty darn exciting. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.